started because we don't want to fall behind, and our speaker has a terrific presentation to share with us, and I want to give her as much time as we can. Good afternoon, I'm Jody Keenan. I have a distinct pleasure of being Vice President Academic here at Seneca College. And welcome again to FSOSS. I know you've had a great morning, and we're going to have an equally good afternoon. Before we introduce our wonderful keynote speaker for the afternoon session, I had a very special function to do, and unfortunately the two people involved aren't here, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's so special. This year we have worked with the Faculty of Communication, Art and Design, the sister faculty to FACET, to develop the marketing material and graphic theme for FSOSS. And this year, one of the graphic theme pieces is the Freedom Bird. So you've seen pictures of the Freedom Bird, I think. The Freedom Bird is actually the creation of one of our graphic design digital media students, whose name is Long Nguyen, and his faculty member, who is Lazo Elwazowski. Unfortunately, neither Lazo or Long could join us today, but I just wanted to acknowledge what a terrific symbol we think the Freedom Bird is of open source technology and FSOSS in particular. And we're going to give Long a small gift to show our appreciation for his work. And just so you know, as a student experiential learning opportunity, that experience of developing a theme and then presenting it to a group of our team in the Center for Development of Open Technology, who are the clients, and having to win that opportunity is very much like what happens in the real world in graphic design and digital media. So we're very proud of Long, and we'll make sure that he gets his gift in thanks for his excellent work. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the afternoon. We just met, and she just talked about the horrendous change in weather from Raleigh, North Carolina, to here in Toronto. I told her that we had an absolutely terrific September and the beginning of October, and it went south on us just 2 days ago in time for her visit. It now feels like November. So I'm delighted to welcome Ruth Suehle. Ruth is the Community Marketing Manager at Red Hat. Red Hat is one of our long-standing supporters and partners here at Seneca, but also of the open source community worldwide. Ruth has supported the open source community through projects such as Fedora, RDO, Or, Gluster, and CentOS. She's also a senior editor and social media specialist for Geek Mom. I want to hear more about that afterwards. I know she's got some young children at home. And co-author of Raspberry Pi Hacks. When she's not focusing on helping to better the open source community, you can find her working diligently at a sewing machine preparing for a new fantastic costume. So I'm sure you'll all want to hear more about that. Halloween is coming. You might be able to take up a few orders, Ruth, before you leave. At any rate, please join me in welcoming Ruth Suehle. Ruth, over to you.
Thanks. As you can see from the title slide or from your schedule, I want to talk to you about makers. And that may initially seem strange to some of you, and you don't know quite yet what that has to do with this event. But as Chris mentioned this morning, we're here to celebrate 30 years of free software. But as you also just heard, I work for Red Hat. And from my point of view, we've kind of won this open source thing in software, what with being a billion-dollar company and all. So what I want to know is what we're doing next with open source. Where do we take the things we've learned, and how do we help make the world a better place with all of that beyond software? So as she mentioned, I work on a team called Open Source and Standards at Red Hat. What we do is support all of the community upstream projects that are so important to Red Hat's success. But that work is really only tangentially related to makers. I also co-authored a book on Raspberry Pi hacks, and I've written for various websites, as she mentioned, geekmom.com, which is just all of the things geeky and mommy and everything in between. But most importantly, I'm also a maker of things. My instinct about everything is, how can I make that thing? If you can sew it or sculpt it or bake it or frost it or solder it or crochet it or knit it or rivet it or Dremel it or hot glue it or somehow improve it by setting it on fire, which is sometimes an option, I've probably tried it. And if I haven't tried yet, I'm probably going to try it tomorrow. So if I don't already know how to do it, I'll figure it out. And that's why I think of myself as a maker. But you also are all makers, every one of you. You might not be makers of cakes or of costumes, but you're makers of code. Or you're a student and you're becoming a maker of things like that. Maybe maker of a data center or something that is a cloudy thing, or a maker of magic because some code fix worked and you don't know why, but you're going with it because it did work. What's important is that you've made something, and you're all makers of open source. So you already understand what open source means. What I want to talk to you about is how the makers of tangible things, of open hardware, and open furniture, and open prosthetics, and all of these things, the biohackers and makers of things that we don't even know about yet, how those things have come into being and why the maker movement is so popular right now. And I hope by the end of this talk I have compelled all of you to get involved in the maker movement, teach them all the things you know about open source, and get beyond the recognizable GitHub accounts and glowing screens and all of that comfort and get out in the world and help. Because you, the ones who already understands the benefits of open source, are the ones who are going to lead in these new communities. Now, the maker movement and open hardware have a different set of challenges from those faced by open software communities. There are new sets of legal issues that arise when we're talking about open hardware projects, and communities are unfamiliar with the evolution of openness and how projects work. Panic a little when somebody else uses what they've made or when something else is closed. There are project management issues and build issues and things that are the same, but a lot of things that are also different. And a lot of makers are also afraid of how you make a profit by sharing. Because of course, we, the open source community, and that whole Red Hat billion-dollar company thing have already solved that, how you make money with open source. This is another good area in which we can help lead them to how it works. And just a plug, all of you who are graduating and need jobs, it's a good place to be. But I'm getting the cart way ahead of the horse. That's sort of the high-level overview. So now let's go way back, way back up and talk about how this whole maker madness started in what probably seems really sudden, but actually is based in human history. Where did the makers come from? They didn't just spring forth in 2006 when this word started getting thrown about from some sort of primordial goo of Bondo and liquid solder. Let's talk about what a maker is. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this word. I love it because it so succinctly defines what it means. It is a person who makes. It is a noun for someone who makes. I hate it because people have some preconceived notions about it. They think of maybe the magazine, or they think of a pile of parts and some LEDs, or they think of a 3D printer. And it is all of those things, but it's so much more. And I believe, like Dale Doherty, who coined the term maker, that it's not just a pile of parts as a 3D printer, it's simply what you have made. It doesn't matter if it's any good, it is simply that you have made something, that you have created. Anything once. We as humans are makers. It's intrinsic to our existence. But there's this path that many of us take as individuals that actually mirrors the course that we have taken as a group over the course of human history. So let's look at that history first. Anthropologically speaking, going way back, we largely recognize the beginning of humans as the moment that we started using tools. And while a few other species use simple tools, we're the only ones who use those tools to make other tools. And then we have the Stone Age, which is when Fred Flintstone came along, made the whirligig. No, it's after lunch. Perk up a little bit. No, the beginning of the Stone Age is the arrival of stone tools, of course. That's 2.5 million years ago. And it seems like that doesn't have a whole lot to do with makers today, but it actually does. We're going to go on a fast-paced course through human history. So tools changed our existence by letting us kill things with something besides our teeth. It gave us independence, and that's the link. And I'll talk more about that later when I talk about the modern maker movement, because before that, we were pretty much limited to things that we could kill with our hands. Tools changed everything. So shortly thereafter, we developed a taste not just for functional creation and tools, but also for art, for aesthetics. And what's one of the first things you did when you were a little kid in preschool or art class? You took a handprint, put it down, you turned it into a turkey or something else. My kids have made everything with their handprints. My time hop just reminded me that in preschool, they even made butt print pumpkins with my infant. We like to stamp things with our body parts. So, much like when you were 5, the people long ago started making their handprints on the walls. This is Cueva de los Manos in Argentina, where it's 10 to 12,000-year-old handprints on the walls. And then came better cave art and paintings and carving and sculpture, things like the Bradshaw paintings in Australia, the wonderwork engravings and paintings in Africa, the petroglyphs in Valcamonica. And then with metal tools, we developed agriculture and machines and ever more complicated machines and things that eventually took us not only to the reaches of the Earth, but beyond the Earth and up into the stars. And choosing this picture on the right was a little bit of a bittersweet choice because it's from STS-135, which was the end of the American Space Shuttle program. But what's actually important is that we went from this to this, all because of that innate spirit to create that is so important to us as humans. But in order for any of that to happen, we didn't have to just be makers. We also had to be sharers. creatures who were willing to tell one another what we had discovered, whether it was how to turn a stick into a spear or how to blow pigment around your hand to make that mark on the wall. And these are my friends that I named Og and Grog. Somewhere along the way, a lot more recent than all of that, we got Og and Grog. And at some point, I imagine, Og turned to Grog and said, "Oh, how you make the hot pit?" And Grog said, "Catch your own lighting." And I also have this theory that Og and Grog were really good friends until one of them wouldn't share how to make the bacon. So, fast forwarding back onto our timeline, how that sharing got derailed by something besides bacon, it got derailed by possessiveness and protection. So in 500 BC, in Sybaris in Greece, they invented patents on innovation and luxury. These Greeks were a lot like me. They liked food. They liked food a lot. They liked it so much that they gave you a year's worth of protection on some delicious, tasty comestible that you had invented. They actually got really rich off of this. In the Roman Empire, the blacksmiths used literal trademarks, marks of their trade, which is where the word comes from, on their swords. They also arguably invented a precursor to the concept of a trade secret that was based around the loss of slaves and what they might tell a new owner. And then what we assumed to be the first copyright battle took a couple hundred more years and happened in Ireland. St. Columba was an Irish Gaelic missionary and one of the 12 apostles of Ireland who all studied under this guy named St. Finian. Now, Columba was really well known for pretty much locking himself in his room and copying books over and over and over again, and all the way up to literally the day that he died. And he would borrow Finian's books, copy them for his own personal use, assorted Bibles and various religious works, and then put them back. And this all worked out really well until Finian noticed. He declared it illegal copying, which probably sounds a lot like a lot of things that you hear today. So Finian goes to the king, and because I am really terrible at pronouncing Gaelic, I like to call him King Copyright McCopywriterson. He ruled in Finian's favor, saying, "To every cow belongs its calf, to every book its owner." And so in other words, every copy of a book belonged to its original owner. This ended into a battle called the Battle of the Book, which killed 3,000 people and had Columba exiled. And I am really glad that sharing MP3 files does not result in 3,000 deaths. In less deadly intellectual property news, unless they were actually using Cylons, the English Parliament started requiring bakers to mark their bread with their marks in 1266. And because I don't only like food, I also like beer. One of the oldest trademarks is that of Lowenbrau, which came about in 1383. So as you can see, all of this started quite a long time ago. The first true patents came along in the 15th century in Italy and were awarded to the glassblowers in Venice. And then England caught on to this idea, and they wanted to use patents as a way to encourage innovation. But instead what happened was about 5 minutes later, somebody else invented patent abuse, and then about 5 minutes after that, somebody invented patent reform. In 1710, the Statute of Anne in Great Britain was the first real copyright act as we recognize it. Trade secret law came into existence in England and the US in the 1800s, and that pretty much brings us up to what you recognize as intellectual property laws today. I know that was a really fast trip through history, and I'm glad you all came along with me on it, because it sets me up for what I want to talk about for the rest of this, which is makers now. So let's talk about how we went from a history of sharing in order to eat and survive to an exploding system of protection and this. And let's think about that on the scale of one person's life instead of over humanity. When you're a little kid, the first thing that your parents taught is to share with others, especially if you had siblings or friends in the neighborhood. For Pete's sake, give that kid your toy. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. It is all we talk about is sharing. But the adults teaching that lesson seem to have completely forgotten it themselves. So they want longer copyright terms and more protection and more patents awarded and shrouds and secrecy around what they've created. They want the bacon. They're no different from Og and Grog fighting over the bacon. So eventually they'll both make fire, and one day the fire is going to launch into the moon, but they would have gotten there a lot faster if Og had simply told Grog how to make the bacon. We all could have had a party a lot faster. So now we've spent centuries trying to squirrel away our secrets to protect what we've created until we think that they're in a state that we would like to share them, which probably means created so that they're as difficult as possible for someone else to reproduce. We've invented this concept of luxury brands and a need for them, and we've created this culture of consuming and disposing instead of creating and rebuilding, which is what the maker movement is about. The maker movement is this slice of humanity that here in 2015 has said, I'm kind of done with that. It's enough. Because people didn't just start creating and sharing again when somebody slapped the term maker on it. It's always been a thing. There have always been crafters and creators and tinkerers and sharing. It was simply what you did for a very long time. You mended your clothes, you fixed your television when it broke, but it was because you could. things were repairable. You could access the tools and the parts and the things you needed to be a maker. And then things increasingly closed up until we arrived at this. And I often come across as an iPhone hater, but they're just a really easy representation of this entire culture. This is the seemingly ubiquitous device in which you can't even change the batteries yourself. Now, a lot of you are way younger, but if I had told my parents in the 1980s that I really, really needed this really, really expensive thing and we couldn't even change the batteries when they died, pretty sure they'd have just laughed. That would not have been an option on the table. So makers are the people who don't want that. They're the ones who recognize this need to create and to share and to fix and to build on what they already have. Vintage Tomorrows is the book that really makes this connection between that time of repairable things and the movement that gained momentum around the same time as the maker movement, and that's steampunk. So if you're not familiar, steampunkers are frequently makers. There's this huge crossover. Steampunkers are, it's this intersection of sort of technology but in a steam-powered time. There are lots of different definitions. But this book talks about the simultaneous arrival as connected through this common desire to return to that time when we owned our things, which we don't. You don't own your things anymore. And that's why the make motto is, if you can't open it, you don't own it. And that's the simple truth. And so, getting to a point finally, it seems that by its nature, by this spirit, the maker movement would be open by default, that it is already inclined to be open source, intentionally sharing, intentionally creating derivative works and building on one another. But the truth, it seems, is actually quite the opposite, and I fear growing in the wrong direction. But there's this growing awareness in FOSS communities about the maker movement, and that's what I'm trying to help spread. In fact, LinuxCon in 2014 had a VP from MakerBot, which I will get back to in a minute, and another from the Open Prosthetics Project talking. We're seeing more of this, and I would like to see that grow so that the maker movement doesn't die from closedness. So now, most of what's going to follow in the next few examples I give you are going to be around open hardware. And open hardware is not synonymous with makers, but it is a really good example and particularly accessible for many of you who are probably familiar with things like Arduinos and Raspberry Pi. It's a good reference point. So, since the maker movement makes you think of all of those things, we'll start with open source hardware, the open hardware movement, which again sounds open by default. In fact, open source hardware has a definition, just like the open source software definition. And these freedoms probably look a lot like the freedoms you saw Chris have on his slides this morning. It's hardware whose design is made publicly available so that anyone can study it, modify it, distribute it, make it, or sell the design or hardware based on that design. And there's an entire organization now, the Open Source Hardware Association. They hold a conference called the Open Hardware Summit, which I first attended in, I think, 2012. It was about the third year they had held it. They had people like super awesome Sylvia, who at the time was about 11 years old. She has this web show for makers where she makes all kinds of crazy stuff. They had a 77-year-old who had created a lathe and a mill for $150 from scraps. They had, if you've ever seen the project where they sort of hack the cockroach to control him, which is freaky, and if you haven't seen it, you should Google that up. And so I was interested in all these projects and thought that there would be this huge open source connection. And so I went, and I wrote about it for opensource.com. And this is the headline that I wrote after that conference. Because this was sort of the optimistic version of how I felt after that event. This was not a culture of open by default, but one of open by accident. It was people who shared because it was the internet age, and that was just sort of what you did. You put your stuff online. It wasn't that they had consciously chosen to be open. It was just sort of this thing that they were doing by accident. And openness has to be intentional. It does not work if you just kind of once in a while put something on the internet. So the keynote that day was Chris Anderson, who at the time was editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, and he started off really well. I had a lot of hope. He said, "Everything I've learned as I built my own business is because people shared what they knew." And then he said, "I don't think we should be dogmatic. We should consider some other possibilities." And then he talked about the limitations of open hardware and concluded that the only possibility was alternatives, like maybe releasing only your schematics or a conditional license with restrictions on commercial use, which in truth is the direction that open hardware has kind of been going ever since. Because one of the other talks that day was Bree Pettis, this guy, who was the co-founder of MakerBot. You guys familiar with MakerBot? Nods, yep. It's probably the 3D printer that you first saw, the first one that you saw. Everybody loves 3D printers, right? The first time I heard of a 3D printer, self-replicating printers, that was kind of my we live in the future moment. Absolutely. Where's my hoverboard? But the 3D printer that really made it take off was the MakerBot. And it started off really well. In 2011, Brie Pettis was talking to everybody who would listen about how absolutely critical openness was. Openness was absolutely all that we needed to make the future a good place. But then the week of that Open Hardware Summit in 2012, he announced that the MakerBot 2 would be closed up in a shiny metal box, and nothing open about it really anymore. But despite that sealed up box, because I am an optimist, I like to look at what MakerBot did leave us, and that's a community of thousands of designers and engineers who are still sharing designs and making 3D printing more accessible on Thingiverse, which came out of MakerBot. This is what it's all about, is the community. And there are still plenty of companies who are doing it the open source way and doing so successfully. Lulzbot is a fully open source 3D printer company. They're not cheap, but they are really good. And if you want a self-leveling printer, that's the secret. Then earlier this year, along came Autodesk. This is the Autodesk Ember. And it's going to take a second for this massively long GIF to load. So I'm going to go ahead and click it while I talk to you about it. If you haven't seen it, it's a digital light processing printer. Oh, there's the magic. You could watch this GIF on loop forever. And so it rises from the resin. It's kind of magical. I could watch it over and over again. Now, they explicitly said when they launched this back in March that they didn't intend it for consumers, because it comes with a $6,000 price tag. That is not, for most people, a consumer level price point. What made the Autodesk Ember really exciting is that they said that they were going to open the CAD designs and the material for the resin. And they said that they were doing it because it was a market opportunity, because analysts expect that 3D printing will be a $16 billion market by 2018. And because right now, that's what 3D printing looks like. Somewhere, depending on who you ask and which printer you have, 3D printing has a 25 to a 75% failure rate. You make lots of pretty things like that. There are a couple of really great Flickr groups called 3D Print Fails. They sometimes look really cool. Autodesk wanted to do something about that. And so while some people were skeptical back in March, here in October, they have in fact opened the things that they said they would. They released Polar Resin 48, PR48 it's called, because it was their 48th formulation, under a Creative Commons share-alike license. Things like this give me a lot of hope. But I digress. Let's go back to that Open Hardware Summit, because there was something else I saw that I thought was a lot more important than Brie Pettis telling a room full of open people that he decided to go closed. From both the presenters and the attendees there, I heard the same stories over and over again. Openness was for convenience. It wasn't a feature. It was not a room of Linux users. It was a room of shiny Macs and some Windows users. They really basically were completely unaware that open source software even existed. Shortly thereafter, I started going to the World Maker Fairs. And the three big ones are New York, Bay Area, and Detroit. And it was originally a really exciting place, full of people who were really excited to share and to show you what they had made and to talk to you about how they did it. And your local mini maker fairs are still a really good place to find a lot of that. But over the last few years, there's been this subtle but important change in what is taglined the greatest show and tell on Earth. I feel like it's kind of become the greatest show and sell on Earth. Because now, when I go up to people at a maker fair and I say, can you tell me about your project? Does this use open hardware? Do you use open software? What are you working on? They say, I can sell you one. And to me, that's not the spirit of a maker, and that shouldn't be the spirit of a maker fair. They want to make a profit now, and they don't see the link that both options are possible, that you can be open and you can still make money, and that you can still be successful doing things the open way. There's a big difference between this sort of booth, which is the Radio Shack Learn to Solder booth at a maker fair, moment of silence for Radio Shack, which technically still exists in the US, but in a sad shell of its former self. SparkFun also runs these Learn to Solder booths at maker fairs and does lots of other really great projects with groups, little LED projects. And then there was a sponsor booth at Maker Faire that almost single-handedly made me start thinking about all of this and probably led to this talk in the end. And it was so shameful that I couldn't find anything but a press release about the fact that it existed. And that was the Purina booth. I still am really fuzzy on what Purina has to do with makers. They were letting you fold a piece of cardstock into a mouse for your cat to get food out of, which I think is a really good way to make your cat eat paper. So anyway, it's a title change, but I think there's still time to turn it. Because makers do believe in innovation, and fundamentally they believe in the same things that we believe in open source. They believe in solving problems, sharing, ideally doing it openly, but most importantly, a greater result for everyone else in the end. And so what we have to do is show them how openness and sharing are the way to that greater result. So First, let's talk about that basic problem that people who don't understand open source are distressed by. It's what caused Brie Pettis to seal up the MakerBot. Clones. Or, somebody took my thing and made it their own thing. Or somebody took my Django Fett and, never mind. So, as evidenced by having a book on the thing, I may spend a lot of time talking about the Raspberry Pi, and I know a lot of you are intimately familiar with the Raspberry Pi. Now, it is unfortunately not 100% open hardware because of that Broadcom SoC, but it's close enough that it's a really great example for this purpose. And because of all this time I spent talking about pies, I do not go to any conference that someone doesn't say, have you seen the fruit pie? There are so many clones. If you can name a fruit, there is a pie for it. And especially once the Raspberry Pi compute module came out, which was the compute on module version with the companion baseboard, there are gobs and gobs of clones of this thing. Sometimes they're just Pi software compatible. Sometimes they add on some more RAM. They're often not $35, which, hello, is the main appeal of the Pi, because it's not like it's the fastest computer on the planet. But is any of this harming Pi sales? Did anyone try to buy a Pi 2 when they first went up for sale? Did you get one that day? How did that go for it? One guy's like, yeah, and the one next to him goes, no. It was rough going for a while. None of those clones are hurting the Raspberry Pi in any way whatsoever, because it is a solid project with a solid plan that knows what it's doing and a solid community to buy it. And if somebody makes an improvement on it, that's the open source way. That's innovation. That means that it's your job as the original project creator to keep improving. So one area that would probably be really happy for the success of being cloned is the open prosthetics. And there are several different projects in this area. It's one of those ways in which bringing open source to maker communities can have a seriously life-changing impact on someone. We build a lot of silly things with Raspberry Pis, and there are some really important projects, but open prosthetics are really, really important to a lot of people. And the Open Prosthetics Project is exactly what its name says. They're working on building better prosthetics for people the open source way, including the hardware and the software and the firmware. Prosthetics are expensive, and they have to be individually fitted. It's a relatively small market, which means it's hard to capture venture capital. It is the perfect place for open source to solve a problem. And for those of you who have open source projects and you don't know how to gather contributors, they have a really good example on their website. This is straight up on their homepage, specifically telling you how you can contribute in different ways. That aside, one of my favorite stories from their site is an evidence of one of the fantastic benefits of open source that's really, really evident in maker communities and what the maker movement is changing, and that is accessibility, and not in a prosthetic sense, but accessibility to participation. This is a group of kids. This is a 2011 LEGO First League group in Oregon. And they knew someone who had been born without arms, but she really wanted to swim with arms. And so they spent their project creating arms for her to swim with. And then the next area that is really useful for all of this is security in both the hardware and the software. And this is an opportunity for openness to make a huge difference in the hardware community and the maker community. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard Karen Sandler, who used to be with the GNOME Foundation, and now she works for the Software Freedom Conservancy. Anyway, she has this really amazing talk that I consider to be the most compelling evidence for the importance of open source. And it has to do with the hackability of implanted medical devices, in her case, a pacemaker. If you watch the show Elementary, there was a first season episode story about someone who was murdered by having his pacemaker hacked. And it's not a story on a TV show. It is actually realistically possible. A third of the medical devices with software sold in the United States between 1999 and 2005 were recalled. A third of them. If you go look up Karen's talk, there is some really interesting stuff from the Medical Device Security Center about how ridiculously simple hacking these devices is, what kind of information they have on them, and what you can do to them. There have been multiple vulnerabilities found in devices that range from sending 45 days worth of insulin at once into a person to sending an 830 volt lethal shock into a person from 50 feet away. It's certainly not a new problem. Even just buggy code, not even crackers, have been responsible for many deaths. As far back as the 1980s, 6 people died from a radiation therapy machine. Several hundred people have died in the last 5 years from those drug infusion pumps. It's a big problem. And none of that is open software. And what we need is openness for these devices, for the hardware, for the software. And that means audit. Whether it's for unintentional vulnerabilities or intentional backdoors and spying. And at least in the United States, the FDA is, I'm going to say, simply not that interested. You are not required to submit the code for your device for review. You can offer it for review, which is not the same thing at all. So we've seen what happens with DRM. We've seen what happens with basic things to our lives like books and movies and music. It's so much more important when it comes to whether it's a device that could kill you. Now we've seen what's happening with unaudited software. I happen to own a TDI Jetta that I'm not really excited about the next month or two for. And over the last year, we're hearing more and more about these insecurities in networking and in other hardware. Earlier this year, Lenovo had the little Superfish adware/malware/vulnerability installer problem. And even a New York Times op-ed piece in 2013 was pointing at open hardware as the key to a more secure internet. Now, 10 years before that, the New York Times, being the one champion in open source software, open source hardware, would have sounded crazy. The New York Times is on our side now. It's time for everybody else to catch up. So how many of you have heard of the Novena? Couple of nods of recognition. It's a really great example of a project trying to fight all of these battles. It was created by the guys who created the Chumby, which was this fun little hack-friendly Linux-based alarm clock and lots of other things, which has been discontinued. But because openness is awesome, it still wakes me up every morning with just about anything I wanted to wake me up with. And so the Novena was designed with full transparency in mind, including security. It was created by these two guys. One of them is named Bunny. Bunny previously found enjoyment in his life by publishing Xbox hacks, and he made every trace on the PCBs himself, the hard way. It's not 100% open, as we see with other open hardware projects, as some bits like the screen are off the shelf, but it's about as open as you get as far as a laptop goes. It runs off of an RC car battery. As an aside, Bunny and No Starch Press released this book called Hacking the Xbox that, as I mentioned, he was into that sort of project. And they released it free as an ebook in honor of Aaron Swartz. And even if hacking the Xbox is not at all of importance to you, if you go to nostarch.com/Xbox free, you can read the letter that he wrote announcing it, which talks a lot about the importance of all of this. And you can see from the quote there, the risk of becoming enslaved by our technology and how important it is to have the right to hack and the right to open. Which brings us to the next and perhaps most obvious challenge that's a bit different for the maker community, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, and that is the legal issues they face, which could be an entire talk all on its own, and I am not a lawyer, but it's too important not to at least mention. Unlike software, which is protected by copyright the minute you start typing it, hardware has a whole other bundle of legal questions. First of all, there's licensing. Now, you guys understand, I think, for the most part, what licensing means when it comes to code. But when it comes to hardware, copyright can still apply to the design files, but not to the object itself. And while patents might still be relevant, largely you'll be facing a lack of protection when you start talking about open hardware. And so there are two major licenses intended for open hardware, the TAFR Open Hardware License and the CERN Open Hardware License. If you are interested in the finer details of all of this, I suggest looking up this paper by Andrew Katz towards a functional license for open hardware. It's about 2 or 3 years old now, but still quite relevant. This is a learning curve with a lot of decisions to make. For example, some people choose to simply open and license the design files instead of worrying about the hardware. There's a lot to sort out. And I mentioned the Open Source Hardware Association. If you go to oshwa.org, oh, look, I have a URL for you, /FAQ. They explain a lot of the details about this if that's your interest area. If that is your interest area, definitely get involved, because this is one of those places where the hardware community could use a lot of help. So we definitely need to work to figure out these issues, and the legal arena is particularly hairy for those prosthetics and for medical devices, because not only do you have the regular open hardware problems to deal with, but also the medical legal complications, because again, you're dealing with whether or not people die, and that's not even its own talk, that's actually an entire other conference, but I want to point it out because it is a huge, hairy problem for them. But fundamentally, wrapping this all up, regardless of any of these problems, it's important to remember that much like the community that's left of that once open MakerBot, you can always have that. You always have that community. You always have the sharing, because that's what's important, is those people working together. So if you don't have a community yet, where do you find a community? Your local hackerspace. This one is from Belgium, and there's a bit of a debate over whether we call these makerspaces or hackerspaces. It's all kind of the same concept. You guys are lucky in Toronto to have 7 of them. It used to be that people could tell me I don't have a hackerspace. That is not an excuse here, and that's really not an excuse in much of the rest of the world either. This is just a section of the United States. The map on hackerspaces.org is now limited to 500 locations at once, so you kind of have to zoom down pretty far to see anything. And some of these are focused in specific areas. One of the ones that I find the most interesting is the biohacker space. A biohacker space is a place that has things like PCR machines and DNA isolation and centrifuges and incubators and microscopes and industrial fridges and freezers and all those things that you would find in a biolab, but without all the trappings of academia. Fukushima disaster spawned this open Geiger counter project. And this is another one of those examples of people really making a difference in lives, because there was not a lot of data coming from the government about where the radiation was. And so they were able to hook Geiger counters up to the internet to get accurate radiation readings, stream the data, all open data for anyone to see, so that the people who lived there could have some actual factual information about what they were being exposed to. And what's important here is the open data. This kid is named Jack. He was the Intel Science Fair Award winner in 2013. He developed a test for the early stages of pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer. And what's important is that he built all of that on open access journals and reading them online, because he was about 14 or 15 at the time. Open data is incredibly critical to each step of this journey. And one of the other things I like about this kid is his mom, because again, I have kids and I like to see parents getting involved and letting their kids have the freedom to try all these things out. And when his school made him take home his homemade arc furnace, his mom, who is an anesthetist, said, "Just don't burn down the house or kill yourself or your brother, because I don't know enough physics and math to know if that's a death ray or not." I like her. So if you've never heard me give a talk before, you tend to leave with a reading list. And the first thing we had was Vintage Tomorrows, which is the super fun book about makers and steampunk. Next on the list is the Maker Movement Manifesto. The Maker Movement Manifesto was written by Tech Shop CEO Mark Hatch. He didn't start Tech Shop, but he's been in charge of it since about 2007. And you don't have a Tech Shop here, I don't think. It's a chain of maker spaces, so to speak, that started in 2006. So Mark Hatch has a pretty bold vision for Tech Shop. He says that Tech Shop has the unique opportunity to arm the maker movement with the tools it needs to change itself and the world. More importantly, he spends the whole book backing that up, so much so that after a while it starts to feel repetitive, but they are really fun stories. And some of them are huge success stories. Tech Shop hatched Square, the credit card payment system, Dodo Case. Both of these are good stories of how failing fast, one of those fundamental tenets of open source, leads to success quickly, and how building something in a tech shop lets you interact with other people who are building something else interesting that might help your project, and you could help them, and all of the open source magic happens. But I have to tell you, my favorite story from the whole book, Hatch is walking around his local tech shop one day, and he runs into this middle-aged guy who's working on what he describes as a poorly constructed, clunky aluminum block-like structure. And he says, "Hello, what are you working on?" And middle-aged guy with this weird-looking device says, "I'm working on a desktop diamond manufacturing device." Because he wanted to make a diamond ring for his wife. And I don't mean like a diamond in a ring, I mean a ring made of diamond. And so Hatch already thinks he might be a little bit crazy, and then he says, "It's cool, all I need to do is rip the magnetron out of this microwave to make the necessary plasma ball." It turns out that Crazy Mike and his diamond plan is actually a physicist who works at a diamond deposition tool company who has the experience, and he thinks he's actually going to do this. What's important is not whether or not Mike actually succeeds, and I really hope he did because the book never gets to that point. I imagine he was still working on it when the book went to print. What's important is that his industry experience told him that to try this would cost $80,000. Tech Shop, it cost him $1,000, thanks to all of the tools and resources they had there. That is an industry-changing factor of magnitude. Other stories from Tech Shop talk about things that used to cost months or years in time now cost a week or days. When you're talking about going from your life savings and a year of work to your quarterly bonus and a week of work, that's the sort of change that can completely shift how R&D and manufacturing and the entire way we bring tangible goods into existence work. And the openness and sharing of that process are the critical pieces to how it all happens. So now we found our simplified path to market. We know that we can change people's lives for the better. What comes after that? Making money. We're back to that. Everyone always wants to make money because once they see one project do it, once they see the billion-dollar open source company, they want to do it too. And I don't blame them because this whole making stuff hobby is super expensive. I know. And so that's why a lot of them turn to crowdfunding. These are a few of the highest funded crowdfunding projects in history. All of them made even more than the Veronica Mars movie, which was pretty astoundingly successful. If you're familiar with the concept of crowdfunding, it's probably through Kickstarter or Indiegogo, which a lot of people see as a shopping mall, and that is not what this crowdfunding thing is about. There's a really great documentary called Maker about the economy around the Maker movement, and in fact, Maker, the movie, was crowdfunded itself. Crowdfunding is really cool because it lets you build a customer base without having a whole bunch of product already on the shelf waiting to go. It lets you have an early proof of concept, reduce risk, and market your idea. But it also forces you to do a little realistic research and planning, especially the older these services get and the more restrictions they put on the people who use the services. Because writing on a napkin at a bar, I'm sorry students, is not actually how you make a business plan. Sorry. Crowdfunding can also be deceptive in that people think it's a million times easier than traditional methods, which it can be, but it is not a one-click mail your stickers, make $1 million kind of way to a business. And again, it is not a shopping mall. As a backer, I think of it, you're more like a Renaissance patron of the arts/makers/creators of things, supporting work that you think is worthwhile, which in the end may result in you getting some tangible good, but that's not actually what this is about. Now crowdfunding options are spreading beyond the Kickstarter model. Kickstarter is an all or nothing funding model. So if you ask for $10,000 and you get $9,000, you get nothing, and I'm sorry, you had a bad day. Now there are new models like Bounty Source, which is offering bounties for problems solved wrapped around GitHub. There are equity crowdfunding sites that offer investors equity in the resulting company. There are lots of different models springing up. And some people see that as a threat to the venture funding model. But it's not a one or other kind of deal. And the smart ones are taking the old model and shifting it into the new model and taking the best of both worlds, starting with crowdfunding and ending with venture capital. And in fact, 10% of crowdfunded projects that pass the 100,000 mark end up with formal venture capital at the end of the campaign. There's definitely room for crossing things. And crowdfunding comes with a lot of benefits beyond the money, not the least of which is reaching your target audience before you actually manufacture the product. You get user-centric design by having your users involved early in the process. This is a picture of a laser cutter called the Mr. Beam that I bought for $650, not bought, supported on Kickstarter for $650 about a year ago, and is, I am sad to admit, still in parts on the third floor of my house. But you get information that is as simple as what the most popular color is. When you asked for a Mr. Beam, you got to pick what color you wanted the 3D parts to come in. Or you get some important, very basic fact, like how many people actually care about that thing that you want to make, which is a pretty useful piece of information to have if you're trying to start a business. It's so effective as a market test arena that even Sony has made a bit of a habit out of crowdfunding, and it's not because nobody's buying the PS4. This was a project that they successfully funded on Indiegogo back about March. They asked for $50,000 for this project for innovators and got $64,000. There's even a crowdfunding professionals association now, which is perhaps a good thing because all of these money-making schemes are not without pitfalls, and it helps, again, if we all are being a community and helping one another. Crowdfunding is not a magical solution to turn the brilliant idea you had in the bar on your napkin into a retirement plan. You're actually going to have to fulfill your promises in the end, it turns out. You have to research and plan, and this is when success becomes a problem. It's the best problem to have. We were too successful. So Order of the Stick, which was this really fun webcomic, asked for $57,000 to print some print copies of the webcomic, and then they got $1.2 million. They had 110,000 requests and couldn't actually handle them all. The printer was not able physically to print that many copies of the book. At the same time, the printer bought another 3D printer campaign, asked for $25,000 and got $800,000. And then the IRS mailed him a tax bill for $300,000. There are all sorts of problems that especially the early crowdfunding users didn't see coming. Pebble, however, actually responded pretty well, and Pebble has become a really successful company out of it. Next problem is this is an act of burying yourself naked before the people you care about, because the first person who's going to support your crowdfunded project is probably your mom. Crowdfunded projects make money from this expanding circle of people, which begins with the people that you know, and then out to their friends, and then way off at the end are the strangers that you probably actually were thinking about when you started making your project. Related, you don't get to just post your project and reap the rewards. You still need this well thought out plan because terrible write-ups don't get money. You can go surf any of these sites on any given day and see all kinds of things that didn't get the money they were dreaming of. Kickstarter actually only accepts about 60% of the projects that ask to be listed. And you need a marketing plan because there are a lot of crowdfunding sites now and nobody's going to magically find your project. There's a lot of stuff out there. And I mean that to be encouraging, not a deterrent, because crowdfunding is rooted in a very open source philosophy, and that's the one of meritocracy, that ideally, in the end, the best ideas win. And that's why it can be really, really successful. OpenDesk is a project that connects designers and makers at the point of furniture creation. They are using a hybrid of crowdfunding and more traditional means of raising money. So they're using crowdfunding in return for investment and an equity stake in the company. And they have a grant from a group called the UK Technology Strategy Board. The Novena is another example that started out as a hobby project and is becoming a more successful crowdfunding campaign, sort of a, oh, that worked out sort of thing. They're sort of serial project creators. So we're wrapping all this up on a good note. We have ways to solve our problems. We have legal issues that we need to address. We know that it all comes down to community and sharing. Makers who are open and successful, who create ecosystems and improve lives, are the types of makers that we want to encourage. And those are the ones who are building their lives on open source principles. And that's where we can help, is for those who don't understand that success model yet. And all of you can take all of your open source ideals and go help those maker communities projects for the greater good. So let's go back to why all of this matters. You're all believers in the open source movement, I assume, as you are here. And so it can be easy for us to forget why openness is important, because it becomes such an innate part of what we do. We just open source is the right way, and so we don't even think about it anymore. So why does it actually matter if these makers are sharing what they create? It's because today's maker is creating tomorrow's device. And it might be a toy or a piece of clothing, or it could be one of those prosthetics that really changes someone's life. And the person who has that creation can now change it. They can fix it, they can make it suit their lives better, they can make it better, or they could just replace the batteries. And then she's become the next maker by doing that. And then maybe she's going to make an even better version. And closing up this process at any point in the cycle breaks the cycle of innovation. And makers are at heart innovators. And so the last thing that we want to do is make a broken cycle of innovation. So I've told you about some successes in the cycle. I showed you the why and the hope, but I've also told you there are a lot of problems, and there are problems that still don't have solutions yet. And that's because, as I hope you have figured out by now, you are the solution. Each of you has a different set of skills and strengths, and you're likely to have strengths in software and code, but you also have friends who are designers or lawyers or good with hardware and not just the software. And so what you can do is use your experience in open source to tell all of those other people how this works and how important it is, and that they can help too. Because now you know the power of the maker, and you already knew the power of open source, and now you know the importance of creating to humanity. And so it's up to you as an open source software community who have seen for far longer the success of openness and how much more successful it is than the alternative, to go become a part of these maker communities, the open hardware movements, and the tangible goods beyond them, and to share with them what you've learned, because you all believe in open, and you are all makers, so go forth and make things better. Thanks. Any questions?
I just wanted to add a comment about your laser printer.
Uh-huh.
I have a couple of files at home. One is for unstarted projects and the other is for unfinished projects.
So since you pointed out, my problem actually with the laser cutter is one of time and documentation, because it was made by a bunch of Germans, and so their documentation is a 60-page PDF, mostly of pictures and a few badly translated words of English. And so then I ran out of time trying. I'm down to the very last step. Like, I'm at the end point of just plugging those wires together, and I haven't found the time to do that. But anyone who would like to come over to my house and finish putting together a laser cutter is totally welcome to. Anyone else? Well, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.